All right, good morning or good late morning to everyone. The break is still sort of breaking up out in the foyer there, so I expect we'll have additional people trickling in. But we wanted to try to get started close to on time, so we have ample time for discussion. My name is Kat Hawkins-Hoffman, and I'm the National Climate Change Adaptation Coordinator for the National Park Service. And you're in a session that will continue the thread that we had in the last session, building on that discussion, which was around indigenous cultures. And this one will focus on a cultural resources toolbox, getting the cultural into LCCs. Our speaker this morning is Marcy Rockman. Marcy is the Climate Change Adaptation Coordinator for the National Park Service. She joined the Park Service in October last year, and she came to us from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She was a AAAS fellow working with the EPA, National Homeland Security Research Center. So there are a lot of questions around that work. It's quite interesting. I've heard a little bit about it. She's also a fellow with the Kotzen Institute of Archaeology at UCLA, and her background is archaeology by training, with a long-term research focus on the landscape learning process, basically how human populations gather, remember, and transmit environmental learning information about the environment, how we relate to the environment. She has conducted field work across the West and in Europe and in the Middle East. And prior to her AAAS fellowship, she worked in cultural resources management in California and Arizona. Her current role with the National Park Service addresses the impacts of climate change on cultural resources across the nation and translating archaeologic information into forms that are useful for federal and partnership level planning regarding adaptation and resilience. Marcy's the lead author of 2 edited volumes about archaeology, and she has published numerous chapters and journal articles. She has a BS in geology from William & Mary and a master's and a PhD in anthropology from the University of Arizona. So want to welcome you all to this session. Marcy is the only speaker. We'll have ample time for discussion at the end. So please keep track of your questions, and Marcy will welcome you to the podium and look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks for that introduction, Kat. Somehow, whenever that gets read, I manage to intimidate myself. And yes, I do have a slight background in Homeland Security, and I know more about bioterrorism and anthrax than I ever expected to know. That was kind of a fluke in my past, but it hopefully has some utility. What I'm going to do today, as you can see from the titles, Locating the Culture in the Cooperative, is, as Kat said, to try and continue our discussion on where cultural resources fit into the LCCs. And as I've been listening to the presentations yesterday and starting this morning, it's very clear that a lot of the origins of the LCCs are coming out of the Fish and Wildlife Service, of a more natural resources focus. And I was starting to get a bit uncomfortable by the end of yesterday saying, the words cultural resource just don't seem to be part of the DNA of LCCs. And I think this morning, hearing the end of Robin O'Malley's talk about the climate science centers and how they'll be developing their programs for research, and then our last session, perhaps it's not part of the DNA, but it does appear to be in some of the enzymes that the DNA is producing, so there is hope. I just want to I see the colleagues from the previous session, and part of me as I was listening to them was saying, okay, my whole presentation should be pretty much, what they said. they did such a lovely job of describing the importance of cultural perspectives and bringing different traditional perspectives into our work with the LCC process and the decision-making process on the landscape scale. It also brought to mind this idea of language and how we talk about our various resources. And I could see different modes of thought. Our previous presenters were very much presenting the native cultures and indigenous perspectives and bringing that very critical aspect to the discussions. And I know, coming from my background, I am more of a scientist. I come from scientific training, including MPACs, and so what I see is this presentation is trying to meld those two worlds, of trying to link those two ways of talking, saying, okay, how do we start to fit together the cultural and the natural resources ways of speaking? So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to start, actually in my position as with the Park Service, which I started in October, as Kat noted, I've been getting a lot of questions from folks in the LCC saying, okay, so what do we do with cultural resources? How do we start to really fit it into our language and our thinking and our priority-making process? Where do we start? And so when I put this presentation together, when I started to think about it, that was the perspective that I was taking. And what I decided to do was, I'm going to start off with some real basics, just like, okay, Cultural Resources 101, so starter kit kind of thing. Then I want to jump into some stories and go right into a bit more of the why, of the really deep integral, this is why cultural resources need to be part of the way LCCs think, the way science get organized, and the way some of the questions are asked and phrased and answered. Then I'm going to circle back around a little bit more and go into what I call some of the middle range area, look at some of the more management aspects of, okay, this is what cultural resources are, this is what some climate change impacts are, these are what some management issues are, and start to do a little bit of that linking up of cultural resources plus natural resources. So I've got a sequence of slides for that on the end. And as Kat said, questions towards the end, but you can see the arc going through the presentation. And I do have the ability to talk a lot because this is what I love and this is what I do, but I will try to keep it to about 35 minutes or so with time for questions. Oops. Sorry, I had, oops. Sorry, I got myself confused. Right, so starting off, this is my Cultural Resources Starter Kit. And it's basically, I wanted to describe when I say the word cultural resources, what I'm referring to. And as defined by the Park Service, the way in which the Park Service manages cultural resources, there are basically 5 categories. These are archaeological sites, buildings and structures, both historical and prehistoric, cultural landscapes, ethnographic resources, and museum collections. Now, briefly, if you're not used to thinking about these, archaeological sites are the things like artifacts that you would find on the ground, things that are on the surface, things that are buried. They may or may not be associated with buildings or other visible structures. So anything from as small as 1 to 2 artifacts on the ground can be described as a site, to things that can be tens of hundreds of acres in size with ditches and walls and buildings. It can range a tremendous amount of variety there. Buildings and structures, I have the iconic Casa Grande in Arizona as the icon for that. Again, those can range greatly in size and scale, but and they can be associated with archaeological materials, but they may not be. If you think of sort of Mount Vernon, George Washington's home, you have buildings and you have outbuildings, and then there are things like remains of his gardens and some of their trash pits. So that's a combination of buildings and structures plus archaeology. Cultural landscapes is perhaps something that needs a bit more definition. It's essentially a bounded geographic space, and the bounding is cultural in nature. It can be, again, they range in size from less than an acre to thousands of acres. They're, as defined by the Park Service, again, they can be historic sites. Again, Mount Vernon is probably a really good example of that, a set of buildings, a historic structure. You can have designed landscapes, things like Central Park in New York City is a designed landscape. You have vernacular landscapes. That's things like, say, a farming community that has an intact set of early farmsteads and then the farms that have built up around it, and if that has stayed relatively intact from the time in which it was built, and you're standing in it, you can see other modern intrusions, that can be considered a landscape. And then you have ethnographic or cultural landscapes as well, things that are defined as having cultural or aesthetic value that may not actually have visible physical components to it. And one example, or very minimal, I used to work in Wyoming, and one of the first projects I had was mapping the Oregon Trail. And there's a point where the Oregon Trail crosses over the Continental Divide. That's called the South Pass, because it's south of where Lewis and Clark passed over the Continental Divide. And you can still see the tracks, the wheels the wagon wheels went over there, but there's nothing else developed in that area, so it looks very much like it did at the time in the 1840s when the wagons started to go over. And so standing there, you get the sense of, okay, this would have been what they would have seen at that time. So that's another example of a landscape. And then there's museum collections, which I've added here because it's one of the things the Park Service manages. So I think it's probably one of the hardest ones to fit into a landscape perspective, because you think, well, it's a building, it's a collection. The role that it plays in some of our climate change work is the idea of it houses a lot of the research, it helps with a lot of the scientific analysis, it's a focus for a lot of interpretation. And then as I get towards the end of my presentation and we start to think about adaptation options for cultural resources, the current curation capacity of a lot of our museums are currently kind of at their limit. So when we start to think about what do we do with cultural resources that are endangered, and if we want to collect them or document them, the interface with the current museum capacity and how to protect and preserve our cultural resources is an issue and needs to be part of some of the decisions that are made. So that is the basic outline of the cultural resource. Oh, I completely skipped over ethnographic resources. I'm so sorry. That's the other one. And again, I can't describe it better than my previous colleagues did, and I think that's why I just jumped right over it. My iconic picture right there is a gentleman collecting stone from Pipestone National Monument. It is the traditional practices and uses of the national landscape and the knowledge that goes with them. So if we have Native peoples collecting, say, plants in a given area, those plants are considered an ethnographic resource, but the knowledge and the traditions and the practices that surround that create the context, are also part of that resource. So altogether, those go together. So it makes a fairly cohesive whole. Okay, this is the slide that I thought I had put first. One of the concepts that came up in discussion several times yesterday was the idea of the human dimensions aspect of landscape of LCCs. And I wanted to just note here that as I understand the term human dimensions, the way it's often been used in the discussions here is that it's the socioeconomic aspects of very modern questions about urban development, land ecosystem values, socioeconomic effects of having different environmental issues. Cultural resources are not equivalent to that. Cultural resources, as I'm discussing them here, are the archaeological sites, the historic buildings, the ethnographic resources, and museum collections, all of those things together. They interface with the human dimensions, with values, and they can be a focus for communications and outreach and discussing what our relevant questions are with modern populations, but cultural resources and the human dimensions aspect are not necessarily one and the same. So if that, sometimes as an archaeologist I'm said, oh, you're a social scientist, which means I deal with everything that involves people, and I say, well, sometimes I can, but what dealing with people is such a broad range that I think it's useful to make that distinction. And what I'll be talking about moving forward from here is primarily the cultural resources aspect, though at the very end I will try to link it back wherever I can to the human dimensions aspect. All right, so that's the basic intro. What I want to do now is actually jump into some of the big why, and why this is really important and interesting and necessary, and talk a little bit the idea, or this question that I often get is, okay, so how do we deal with cultural resources at a landscape scale? Because I've just given you that list of archaeological sites and buildings and museum collections, so forth. They're items and they're defined spaces and they are essentially fixed in place, and I'll go into that in a bit more at the end when we talk about the management considerations. They're not the same thing as a wildlife corridor. They're not the same thing as a complete animal population. So what do we do with them? How do we start to build them up into these big sections of the country that we've defined as ecosystems? How do we start to interface with that? And what I want to do is give you basically 3 case examples of current understanding of human activity and essentially the human story at a landscape scale during a time of environmental change. Number 3 are one in the U.S. Southwest, which I'll talk about first, the Chumash on the California coast, and then a very new example from the western side of the Everglades. Everglades, the group that doesn't even have a formal name. It's mentioned on one map written by DeSoto as Muska ? Very neat. All 3 examples come from the time period of the medieval climatic anomaly, or medieval warm period, which is about 8900 to about 1300. This period sounds vaguely familiar to you. It was characterized in Europe by fairly warm, stable climates and actually a lot of agricultural productivity, and the surplus from that is one of the things that helped build the Gothic cathedrals in Europe. So it was a beneficial time for them. Not so much in the U.S., and so that's what I'll talk about here. Okay, starting looking at the U.S. Southwest. Sequence of droughts actually was how that period manifested particularly across the U.S., but in the American Southwest, a sequence of droughts. You can't, it's not legible to you, but the graph on the lower left-hand side, the really dark bars are really bad droughts, and the intervening gray droughts gray bars are slightly less bad droughts. When I talk about the American Southwest, there are actually a number of populations that existed there at that time. Most of you may be familiar with the Anasazi. The number 1 on the map is the Anasazi right around the Four Corners region. Number 2 in the Phoenix and Tucson Basin is the Hohokam. 5 down in the south is the Mimbres culture. Zuni is number 3, and 4 is the Salinas culture. So a number of groups that are identifiable. They have their own cultures and practices, their languages, multiple people moving around on the landscape. Now, what's really interesting is looking at the histories of these different populations. You can actually see multiple responses to these sequences of droughts. In the Four Corners region, there is a process of initial dispersed small settlements, farmsteads, small hamlets. Then as the droughts piled up by the mid-11th century or so, populations started to aggregate and collect and form larger settlements around available water sources. Another drought continued. Larger aggregations, and you start to find a picture down here of Chaco Canyon, larger aggregation sites, really bad droughts at the end of the 13th century, around AD 1290, and after that the population dispersed. The Mimbres culture down the south actually had a slightly different process. They were it was dispersed populations first, then they re-aggregated, and then, I think they did dispersion first, and then re-aggregated, and then depopulated. And so they had this movement of populations back and forth in response to these sequence of droughts. There are 2 points I wanted you to get from this. One is, you can see these different populations actually responding to their environment at a time, making a decision, and then having to respond later on to that decision that they had made previously. They made the best decision that, as we can see it, they could at that time, given what they had, and then they were in this, for instance, if you see the Anasazi, they aggregated, got people to water sources, but then those water sources dried up, so they put more people together, and then suddenly there weren't that many choices left to go. So we could see it. So they had to disperse. So that building up of decision-making, and it's a really basic point, but we would never be able to document this movement across the landscape and this response to these environmental changes without building up from lots of individual sites to larger cities and bringing together information from across the landscape scale across time. So that brings it all together. Picture down here is colleagues' excavations at a little site called Burnt Corn, which is in New Mexico, and it's really classic. It's not Chaco, it's not big, it's not sexy, but it actually has added some really interesting dated points to our knowledge of the area. Now, the Chumash on the Central California coast is a very different example example, because they actually stayed in place throughout the medieval climatic anomaly. They are an identifiable culture during that time. By AD 650, they were in full villages. By AD 950, you could see them intensifying fishing. Between AD 650 and 1300, you could see in the archaeological remains, there is intensified exchange from as far as the Central Valley of California out to the coast and then out to the Channel Islands. By about AD 1000, you have a spread of dialects, so different Chumash languages have distributed themselves across the interior valleys out to the coast. And you can also see a shift in the size of their populations, and it looks like the chieftains were no longer controlling the sources of some shell and their different areas of fishing production, but they actually had put themselves between the areas that were producing these different things and essentially controlling the trade. And what I do find really interesting is after AD 1300, once the droughts had eased somewhat, there was a decrease in violent injuries evident in the skeletal populations of that area. Now, 2 points from this. One, Chumash, again, an identifiable site that stayed in place throughout environmental fluctuations. And as we can see with the evidence of violent injuries, stayed in place. We're often talking about resilience and resistance, and what does it mean to be a resilient society? Do we classify this as a resilient society? They kept their identity intact and made it through, but we often don't talk about what's the stress that can be involved in actually making it through an environmental fluctuation, and the Chumash are an interesting example of that. And then some of the ethnographic work that's been done with the Chumash, and I don't know how far back this tradition goes. From what I have been able to read and study and ask questions about, it's a current practice. There's an annual ceremony, an annual recognition of annual conflict between essentially the sun and coyote. If coyote wins, it's a good year. If the sun wins, it's a drought year. And it's recognized that every year this struggle between sun and coyote takes place. And I'm fascinated seeing the apparent flexibility and mobility of this culture through what we now know were some pretty major environmental fluctuations. If that mindset of, yep, change is going to happen, is going to come through, and I turn on the news every morning and there's something like, oh my God, the Dow Jones is down 0.2%, oh my God, we need growth, we need growth, we need growth. And I think, how might we organize our lives differently if we knew every year we didn't know what the following year was going to bring? If we knew that the decision was going to be made a year out, that conditions might be different, how might we organize our life and our economy and our flexibility a little bit differently? So that's something, again, that can, the landscape scale in this big population picture brings together. Now, finally, this is the example from the Everglades, and it is actually the information that we currently have is the product of one of the Park Service's own Southeast Archaeological Center scholars. She recently completed her dissertation on this area. We knew very little about it. She did a lot of the just basic motoring through the mangroves, stomping through the swamps, pushing through the trees, doing the hardcore willing mapping, and she was able to identify that sequences of shell mounds. We knew that there were shell mounds out there. She actually mapped what they looked like, how big they were, could figure out the patterns and how they appeared to have grown over time. This is my really bad little PowerPoint model of a wing shell structure that when they developed fingers and bows, view through the trees up on the top. There actually appear to be water features. It may have been a place to put canoes. It may have been a place for fresh surface water. Really interesting architecture to these mounds. That's the point. And the other thing is, they're enormous. These things are huge. Down at the bottom, people for scale, these things are 2 to 3 meters high, tens of meters long to hundreds of meters long. Freaking lot of shell. I mean, enormous amounts of shell. What our scholar also did is she radiocarbon dated the shell. How fast had these mounds developed? And in many of the mounds that she was able to date, the dates at the bottom of these mounds and the dates at the top of the mounds are essentially equivalent, which suggests that this huge amount of shell, these mounds were put together in the space of 1 to 2 generations. Really, really fast. Large amount of shell, lots of predation. Because of the scale of work that involved, that was a massive amount of work, we're now starting to having other questions. And I said, well, that's a lot of, I just had the chance to go down and actually visit these. Can you see anything about the health of the oyster population in there, and she said, actually, I couldn't look at that in real detail, but I can say the shell at the top of the mounds is a lot smaller than the shell at the bottom, which is a classic signal of population depletion. This is the really fun part. Coastal mangroves were all abandoned between AD 1290 and 1300. Populations left the area. They moved further inland and formed some additional other types of mounds and settlements farther inland away from the coast. You may recognize these dates. Those are coterminous with the same dates that the Chumash were dealing with droughts, and the same that the folks in the interior southwest were dealing with a lot of droughts. So a lot of questions have just come up. So this depletion of the oyster populations and this movement of people, was that an economic depletion? Did they get on some roll? Growth had to happen and depleted the oyster populations and they had to move? Was it an environmental fluctuation? Suddenly they were exploding oysters all along, and then downturn the drought came and the populations couldn't support it, or was it both coming together? And in the past few weeks, they're actually starting up a project to look at some oxygen isotopes and try to address this question. The really cool part about this, why it's actually interesting for the LCCs, is for a long time we didn't even know that this kind of question could be asked in this part of southern Florida. It was a blank space on the map. Now we actually know we have some social issues going on. We have a target to start looking at what environmental fluctuations that we knew were happening elsewhere in the country actually would have had some very measurable potential real effects here. A little bit of policy here. At the top is a quote from the 2010 Interagency Climate Change Adaptation Task Force that was run by the Council on Environmental Quality at the White House. So folks up near the top, 2 of their recommendations out of a total of 8 recommendations in their report said, 1, to expand what is really needed to address climate change. 1, to expand research on relevant social and behavioral sciences to improve understanding of human responses to change. And 2, identify the social and ecological tipping points and thresholds beyond which change is sudden and potentially irreversible to help guide decisions regarding intervention and planning. They're looking for big social information. How do social systems work? How do we interact with environmental change? But then a little bit at the bottom from the 6, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the 6 Americas report? Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads. They just did an update to this report. It came out in, they did the reanalysis in May of 2011, when released the data at the end of last year. As you can see, the climate change deniers are still with us, but there is actually still a number of people that are willing to listen to information. My point here is that it's going to be very difficult for us to answer the questions at the top, looking only at the present. If we really want to know what tipping points look like, what social and behavioral change comes from, how it works over a long time in order to make things happen, the present alone cannot provide all of this requested information about human environmental adaptation. Cultural resources really has the capacity to provide that at a landscape scale. So again, just making that point. Lots of potential. These are the stories that we currently have, but there are many more that can be put together. Right, so with that soapbox that I've just been standing on, how do we actually start to do this? How do we start to take what cultural resources are and start to bring them together into the natural resources framework and the management framework and everything that the LCCs are setting up? This is a table that's probably better just analyzed at a future point when you're trying to sit down with it, but what I've started to try to do is just walk out, these are what the categories of cultural resources are, and then these are the kinds of information and things that they bring with them. These are their place-based information, the kinds of time that they bring together, and then starting to think towards that human dimension and communication, outreach, and interpretation, these are some of their communication pathways. And I know I just spent a lot of time talking about the other stuff, so I'm going to say this is here, and I think this will be on website, so if you want to look at it later and study it, I will move on. Okay, so those are all the things that cultural resources bring to the table. There are, of course, those considerations that make it really integrating deeply cultural resources, those kinds of cultural resources with natural resources analysis and landscape scale management a bit sticky because they do have their own characteristics. For instance, the significance of place. Most cultural resources are either fixed in place or they derive a lot of their significance from place. They are not mobile. So they do have that relationship to a place. They are unique in a sense because every cultural resource that we have is a record of a human activity at a given time and a given place and a particular piece of behavior. It's the record of human use of that place, so therefore it has unique. There is no other thing quite like it. There might be other things similar to that, or it might be completely unusual, but there is that sense of uniqueness of each cultural resource. Because of those two, there's the essence of irreplaceability. Cultural resources don't reproduce. Once gone, they're gone forever. We can't get them back. We are adding more cultural resources as we move forward in time. There's this moving window. Things that are 50 years old or older are considered cultural resources. So in that sense, we are adding to the record as we go, but we can't add anything on the back end. And what this all means for ultimate climate change adaptation, because they're fixed in place or have their significance in place and they don't reproduce, cultural resources can't themselves adapt. It's very difficult for most of them to actually adapt themselves. So the things that can adapt and things that can change is us and how we respond and deal with cultural resources. So I just wanted to make sure we have those in mind. Okay, however, there is hope, and I started trying to lay out here some of the relationships between cultural resources and natural resources, just so you can start to see where they fit together and where they can actually use some of the same management techniques and ideas. And I came up with some cellular icons. If you think of archaeological sites, human-made modified items in an environment, similar with buildings and structures, cultural landscapes actually incorporate many natural resources in them. With ethnographic resources, they are often essentially the same, or bounded and identified as the same thing. And when there's collections, it often is the building set off on the side. So just for mental organization purposes. And I'm thinking in terms of moving forward, in terms of what science do we need and how to move forward with management, they all do need inventory, vulnerability assessment, monitoring, and adaptation options. And I pulled this out from one of the talks yesterday, saying these are the things that are needed for natural resources, but we also need them for cultural. So in the final set of slides, I was just going to mention brief things, again, sort of a starter kit for what inventory, vulnerability assessment, monitoring, and adaptation means for cultural resources. Then we're done. Ready for questions. Okay, inventory. A lot of inventory for cultural resources, like natural resources, you have to go find it. You need to go see it. You need to go identify it. There are mandates for the documentation and inventorying of cultural resources. This is not an exhaustive list. National Historic Preservation Act, Section 110, states that federal agencies are responsible for inventorying all the cultural resources within their holdings. Problem is there's a lot of land out there and it takes a long time, so that isn't done. There's the State Historic Preservation Offices, that's the SHPO or SHPO. They are the repositories at the state level for a lot of that information, so that can be a focus for accessing that information, figuring out which inventories exist. There are issues with the confidentiality of site, particularly archaeological site location information, and that is for concern regarding looting and inappropriate use of archaeological resources. So we like to think that issue can be overcome, but it does exist, and so that is a coordination that will need to happen. And then just in terms of the areas where it needs to be filled in, there's pedestrian survey, if you walk out and you find it, and historic and ethnographic research. Okay, with vulnerability assessments, this is another chart that I've been working on for a while, and I apologize again, there's a lot that I've dumped in here, and it's just the idea of trying to walk out the different impacts we're expecting from climate change, particularly things like flooding, storm surges, temperature extremes. I call it the far left column is my dread-ation list: inundation, desiccation, deterioration, destruction, invasion, and disruption. All the things that can happen, and again, just trying to crosswalk where those effects come in. Again, some of them will be particular to cultural resources, but a lot of them are going to crosswalk fairly well with natural resources. So again, this is probably a chart better referred to later. Now in terms of monitoring, there is the need to identify, again, take those impacts, figure out what's most vulnerable, and then start to say, okay, what's being affected, what is vulnerable, what is threatened, and what is endangered. And I just wanted to mention two current projects with respect to monitoring that might link in well to CC work, which you know that it's going on. The Park Service has a project across the Intermountain West and Pacific West region known as Vanishing Treasures, and it focuses a lot on the adobe and the Pueblo structures there, and they have, among other things that they do, they've installed quick monitors on a lot of structures, and some of them have been there for upwards of 50 years. One of the problems that they've run into there is really frequent monitoring and checking of the crack monitors, and I was talking with one of the head of the program last week, and she is trying to get funding to make sure we can go out and check the crack monitors after, not just on a regular basis, but then after major storm events, so that they can actually determine, is it slow deterioration that has the greatest effect on these structures, or is it a more punctuated equilibrium kind of issue? And that just takes the manpower to get out there and check the crack monitors. Then the U.S. Forest Service and Park Service and some academic partners, as well as local Native American tribes, have been working in ice archaeology, and in Glacier National Park, Rocky Mountain, and several parks up in Alaska, they are monitoring the retreating edge of ice patches and are finding a lot of things that are melting out of the ice. Many of them are perishable materials and things that are radiocarbon dated back to as old as 7,000 to 8,000 years old. So if you want an example to talk to someone about who's not sure that climate change is really happening, we have things that are melting out that clearly have been buried for that long. And then finally, some adaptation options. So what do you do? Once we've identified threatened, vulnerable, and endangered resources, what is the universe of options that we have on the table? This is a list that I've started developing in concert with several of my Park Service colleagues, and we've been getting it around since, not telling you how to make these decisions yet, that's not the bottom of the list, but this is just the universe of options that we have, and they include things like don't do anything, but assess the need for rate and monitoring. 2, remove or deflect the stressor. 3, modify the resource itself to better withstand that stressor. So that roof over Casa Grande, keep some of the things off. It might include taking a building and trying to make it more resistant to a new species of termite, something to that effect. There's movement. You can relocate some or all of the resource. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard of the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse that got moved back. Or you can allow movement to happen. There are fish ponds along the coast of Hawaii that the discussion of just letting them move upward as the land subsides and the sea rises. They're still a cultural resource. They're just not going to stay in the same exact place as they had been originally. Then there's data recovery, and that's really intensive recording. Full-scale excavation, if it's an archaeological site, a very intensive recording effort for other types of resources. And then you let the location go. You say, we're done. We can't save it. Record and then let go, that's a lesser level. That's from cultural resource management. It's like we document that it was here, and then we say goodbye. And then 7, I've put interpret the change, because climate change is the heritage of the future. It is the record of our interactions with the environment. And this is the idea that we can actually start to interpret some of the things that are happening around us, and that may apply across multiple of these other options. Of course, this is the universe of potential options, and the other things that need to happen along with applying this list is trying to figure out how do we start to make the decisions between these various options for resources that are going to be affected. We're calling it now a decision-making framework, and one potential model for doing this is the National Register of Historic Places criteria, looking at significance. In order to do that, we need to start doing field studies to support those decisions, and that I'm going to just link back to some of those big studies that I told you about earlier, that idea of what do we know, what do we not know, what can we know, and how can resources that are threatened or vulnerable help us make some of those decisions, and then policy standards and guidance to support those decisions. So all of those are discussions and decisions that need to be made, and the bigger the scale and balancing act, the better they will be. One final thought, this was a very inspirational quote that I found many years ago, and it's guided a lot of my research, so I share it whenever I can. Humans adapt not to their real environment, but to their ideas about it, even if effective adaptation requires a reasonably close correspondence between reality and how it is perceived. So again, something to think about for a long time, but it's that idea that how we think about our environment, how we think about our past, how we think about our place in it, how we think about our future, all guides how we interact with our environment. And so, again, that idea that cultural resources is a very integral part of how we move forward at the landscape scale. Thank you very much. Questions?
Thank you very much for your...
Please stand, so everybody can hear you, please.
Gary Morishima. I have a couple of quick questions. One, I wasn't sure how the efforts at cultural preservation relates to the Treasured Landscapes initiative within the Department of Interior. The second is perhaps more of a comment, but one of the things that struck me from the presentation is that I think there's a tremendous opportunity for you to provide ecological function through cultural practices in terms of indicators of the environment.
Yeah.
The Cooperative tribe, for example, in Northern California, has a world renewal ceremony. And part of that ceremony involves floating canoes down the Clinton system. And depending upon whether the canoes can traverse that area successfully, that's an indicator of the health of the environment, of the health of the ecosystem.
Let's see if, so you had a question about, first, about the Vanishing Treasures program?
Treasured landscapes.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm understanding. We have the Vanishing Treasures program, which is attempting to document a lot of the traditional building practices in the Southwest in that area, and to date, they've been working more with damage to structures that has been identified by park staff on sort of a resource-by-resource basis, and they are now actually trying to interlink their analysis and predict more which resources are more likely to be affected, so that it's not to wait for the phone to ring with a damaged resource, but actually predict on down the line which resources are likely to be affected and how they're being affected by different environmental forces. I'm not familiar with treasured landscapes, so I need to do that. And then I would just say thank you for that example, and that definitely, with the canoes, that's one of the things that I think is really fascinating, and I want to figure out how to better live up to a lot of decision making on how to preserve it and figure out how to build the best means to start to link that to other decisions that are being made. And I would welcome any suggestions you might have on making that happen and figuring out how to make that go.
So are the cultural resources just things, or are they also living cultures and people? And if so, how does that relate to your presentation?
The category of ethnographic resources is very much the one that links to the living people and the living knowledge and the things that are very real and present with us today. The Park Service has been without a chief ethnographer for a while now, and we're in the process of hiring a new one, so there has been a bit of a down drop in our activity and definition of that category, but we're very much looking forward to bringing that back up to full scale. But we do very much consider that to be a very key part of our resources. So looking at that, there is also a history and oral history part of the Park Service. They've been focusing quite a bit on park history, but I've been pushing them a little bit to start thinking about, again, environmental histories and building up that aspect as well.
Greg Baylor, LCC. So in your presentation, you made reference to a number of ongoing efforts of agencies, mostly Park Service, in actual management actions relating to cultural resources. And then you had the one slide that at the bottom said, we also need these things.
Yeah.
And given that LCCs are less about actually taking management actions, rather than informing those actions, I wonder if you could be a little bit more explicit about how these ongoing actions could relate to the LCCs. What can the LCC actually bring to
Actually, to help answer that, I'm going to go back up here. Just a little bit of background. The initial reason I started coming up with this list of adaptation options right now, we have a researcher who's working with the Park Service on coastal adaptation issues, and he's building, we're calling it a coastal adaptation handbook, and the idea is to start to lay out options for resources that are identified as being risks for sea level rise and storm surges. And the idea is just list out natural resources, infrastructure, cultural resources across several of those big categories, and then start saying what are the various options, and then the idea is to interlink them. So if you take one, you choose one particular option for one resource, understand it may have implications for other surrounding resources. For instance, if a road is being eroded and one of the options is to armor it to protect that road, it's important to make that choice, understanding that that will have implications for shoreline habitat and potentially cultural resources that are nearby because they're potentially more prone to erosion. And one of the things that this researcher has said, and I think he said it extremely well, we're going to lay out this handbook because we want to give managers and people making decisions permission to think outside the box, or multiple boxes to stand on, the wide universe of options. But then the other thing is we have these options, and decisions among them and how to make those decisions should be coordinated at regional and larger scales. Because if everyone says, you know, we're going to armor, or we're actually going to prioritize, everyone here is going to prioritize shoreline habitat, then say if somehow everyone on the East Coast decides we're going to protect shoreline habitat, then the infrastructure is going to be a problem and cultural resources may be impacted. So actually, we may have this list of options, but there is a need to start prioritizing and say, okay, where do we most need to protect the shoreline habitat versus where are non-negotiables for cultural resources? Are there things that just those need to be protected, potentially at the expense of some other natural resources or other infrastructure? Or where do we start to do that trading off? And I think that at the level of the LCC is where some of those decisions could be made. Start saying we have this over here, this is endangered over here, and start that real balancing act of what data we have, what are the options, over what time frame, what investments can we make. And so
policy standards, if you just struck that, I would see that you could change the heading also need to LCCs to do this.
Absolutely. And can definitely contribute to that. Yes. Thank you. Janet, and then
This is more of a comment than anything. I think another way that LCCs can interface with cultural resources is helping to understand the future changes that are happening on the landscape, and then looking at what of those cultural resources are going to be vulnerable to those future changes, like some ethnographic resources may actually be natural resources, and then as we're going about our natural resource efforts, being aware of where those linkages are as well.
I would agree. I'm sorry.
With the National Wildlife Federation, I'm wondering if you know of any Park Service units that have actually conducted unit-specific vulnerability assessments with regard to their cultural heritage resources, cultural resources, and if so, if you've got any adaptation plans that are being implemented that are being lessons learned.
To date, that I know of, there's been one integrated natural cultural resource vulnerability assessment. It was done for the Badlands, and it was just finished just as I was coming on board at the Park Service. So I'm still learning about the process and how the approaches were made. And I think it was a good first start. And a lot of the resources in the park they were able to focus on were actually the ethnographic resources, because there's a lot of plant collecting that takes place in the Badlands. So there was a lot of cross-analysis of what's the nature of the plant communities, what are the potential impacts on those plant communities, and then the gathering activities that are going with them and how would those be affected. one of the things that was not possible to get into that vulnerability assessment were things like the specific locations of archaeological sites. That information wasn't incorporated. They did recognize in the Badlands erosion is always an issue, and so that's the point that was able to go to. So in future analyses, I would like to push for getting some more specific location analyses there, but they were able to take the gathering practices and did, I think, a very nice job of linking those two from both the natural and cultural perspective. Yeah, 1, 2, 3. Sure. Yeah, sure. Okay. Good. Yeah.
Washington Conference and National Park Service.
Great.
I just wanted to add an answer to the question about studies. April 20th, there's a Southeast Region climate change tool study that's actually going to be looking at cultural and natural resource responses to adaptation tools for climate change. And April 20th is when it's being presented to U.S. Fish and Wildlife regional managers and Park Service regional managers, the directors. And then they'll be selecting the parks to do some kinds of that. So, I think that's probably some lower growth at that point. It'll take probably a year before they do that. The goal is to come up with some tools that all the parks can use. Now, it's specific to transportation because federal highway restrictions.
Okay.
But at least it's definitely.
Did you say the Southwest?
East.
Southeast region.
Okay. Yeah. Great. Thank you.
My name's Lucy Moore, and I'm under contract and a facilitator and mediator. I'm under contract to the U.S. Institute for Environmental Conflict Resolution, working with J.R. Newhouse, and he and I are announcing ourselves in every session because our mission is to increase and improve the participation of tribes and indigenous peoples in the LCCs and CSC processes. So I also have a question about that for you.
Yeah.
In your both your actions, your planning, your decisions about how to adapt. What kind of relationships do you have with current tribes that may have an interest to claim on either legal or cultural claim on those resources? How has that been to work with them, and what context do you put that in?
So that, unfortunately, I have to say that's been more of a gap because I started in October, and so have been trying to get up to speed on the structure of efforts that currently exist. It's been through this two-way street. The Park Service has a climate change response program which had several projects already ongoing, so we've been trying to figure out how to fit cultural resources into those ongoing structures. And then I've been running through the cultural resources program of the Park Service, trying to understand where climate considerations can best fit within those, and things as basic as our GIS capacity to start understanding locations and so forth. And because we've had this gap of a chief ethnographer who we knew was coming on board and will be on board later in the spring, that is a piece I said, let me not step in because there's so much else other learning I have to do once this other person is on board, and I can start to work through them and not build relationships that then later should go through this other person. At the moment, I wish it was more developed at this point, but it currently is on hold until that person is more firmly in place, and I can start to build the program with them, in concert with them. The one thing that we are doing, there will be in later July, NOAA, in coordination with the Smithsonian, is doing a symposium on Indigenous knowledge and climate change, and it will be held at the National Museum of the American Indian. And it started as it grew out of some of the Pacific West tribes, and it's now grown into something that still has a coastal focus, and the Pacific West tribes have been very instrumental in developing it. They will be staffing the panels, but it includes representatives from across the U.S. and many. We're still working on getting the representation, but I've been involved with NOAA in trying to identify as many different regional partners to pull in as we can, and the Park Service will be co-sponsoring that. So at the moment, I'm sorry to say that's the current focus that we've been doing, trying to get that piece up and running. But once we have an ethnographer, I'm looking forward to expanding much more fully. Sure.
adopted the sort of protectionist approach, and I understand that that's related to the mission of the National Park Service. But one of the things I think it's important for the Park Service to recognize is that the way in which they manage the lands within the national parks can have a tremendous effect on ecological functions that those parks actually provide. In some areas, we've seen fire exclusion policies, for example, causing very significant problems in terms of maintaining the ecological history and basis of those lands, and doing things like prescribed burning or the introduction of those kinds of practices, I think, are quite important. But that's an area, I think, that deserves some attention. The landscapes of America, they weren't virgin, untouched lands. They resulted from the intervention and the influence of human communities. And I think it's important to understand that the interest is to maintain the ecological functionality of the landscape which the national parks are important.
I mentioned, I wasn't sure how to fit this into what was becoming a fairly long presentation. Thank you very much for that comment. So I'll mention it here. There's currently underway at the Park Service an effort to revise a policy document that had been in place from the early 60s. It's referred to internally as the Leopold Report, and it was a document that spoke primarily to wildlife management, but it's ended up, as I understand, sort of growing in importance and building on the Park Service Organic Act to preserve unimpaired the resources under our protection or that have been given to us for care. And the concept within the Leopold Report said that the function of taking care of these places was to, quote-unquote, preserve vignettes of primitive America. And that's what encapsulated that idea of trying to capture or keep a landscape in a particular state. They're in the process of revising the Leopold Report now, and the revision, as I understand, is slated to be released at the end of this summer in August. And one of the central core tenets of the revision is to recognize that humans have been on the North American landscape for 14,000 plus years, and that the concept of a pristine, untouched wilderness is in so many places a fallacy. The landscape has a very, very deep human history and human capacity, and that needs to be part of its management moving forward. So we're all really looking forward to that. I don't know what form it will take, but in terms of that final point of policy standards that we need, that we hope will give us some further guidance and basis on which to make some other decisions looking forward. So that's coming. Thanks.
So let's see, we've got a break now till 12:45 for lunch, and then we'll have concurrent sessions resuming at 12:45.